Welcome to session 35 of our class on understanding biblical literature. We're in chapter 20, covering Old Testament poetry. And as stated in slide number 2, the fact is that over 1/3 of the Bible is comprised of poetry. Now, the poetic books of the Old Testament are Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Lamentations. And the poetry of Old Testament focuses on our emotional response to God as well as on our emotional response to those who are hostile to God and His people. Now, this emotional response can be filled with joy or its opposite emotion, despair. So it's our choice as to how we're going to respond. And, to again do so with joy or to do so with heartache and despair. Now, in the textbook, you have a discussion of the idea of jet engines and paintings. This is slide number 5 in the PowerPoint. And the point that they're making with that illustration is that, jet engines, the story goes that one of the authors visited the Smithsonian at the Air and Space Museum, and he says you could follow step by step through one of the exhibits and learn of the discovery of and implementation of and improvement of jet propulsion. And he says it's a very logical step-by-step process that you find in that museum. But when you go over to the Museum of Fine Arts of the Smithsonian, you come to paintings which are not so step-by-step, logical, rational, thinking as to how to get to their meaning and what they're about. The example that he gives on slide number 6 is the painting of the repentant Magdalene. In this painting, he says, you see the emotions of human life. You see fear, love, hate, despair, triumph, beauty, and disgust. And paintings such as this connect with us in a way that is similar to poetry, because both connect with us on an emotional level. One of the things they point out is the fact that in the mirror, in the painting, is the skull that is there, and the question is Magdalene looking at the mirror and seeing a skull in her as if that is her face because of her past sins as a prostitute, or is the skull that is on the table showing in the mirror? And the fact that she has her hands on the skull, what exactly is the meaning of that? And you could go probably any number of ways with interpreting this painting. But well, I guess that is what they're trying to get. Um, the point they're trying to make is that poetry connects with us on the emotional level, not on the rational and um, and logical manner. Now, let me make sure we understand that the when we use this painting as an example of connecting on the emotional level, we do not mean that you can go to poetry in the scriptures and just put any meaning on it that you want. We're dealing with inspired scriptures, okay? We're not dealing with a painting that different people take different ways, and it doesn't really matter which way you take it. What it means to you, it means to you, okay? Unless, of course, you have a description by the painter who says, this is what I meant by this. If you don't, then you're free to put any meaning on it that you want. And it won't matter, because it's not about God, it's not from God, but the scriptures are. So we can't just go in and put any meaning on this that we want as far as the poetic material of the Old Testament. Now, when we look at elements of Old Testament poetry, the first thing we notice is terseness. This is in slide number 7. This element refers to a poet's use of a limited number of words. For example, in Psalm 25 and verse 4, it says, show me your ways, Lord, teach me your paths. This is an example of terseness. In the Hebrew, the first line has only 3 words, and the second line has only 2. Okay, that's in the original language. And when it comes into English, it still is much shorter than many other passages. Okay. Also concerning elements of Old Testament poetry, in slide number 9, we have the structure. Specifically, in this case, we talk about parallelism. This element names when 2 lines of text are used to convey a single thought. And this is the dominant element of Old Testament poetry. Now, there are several types of parallelism. First, there is synonymous parallelism. This type of parallelism involves a close similarity between lines using words with similar meanings, such as in Psalm 2 and verse 4, the one enthroned in heaven laughs, the Lord scoffs at them. So what you see here is the one enthroned in heaven is equal to the Lord. It's synonymous with the Lord. And in laughs is synonymous with scoffs at them. Excuse me. The next type of parallelism is developmental or synthetic. In this type of parallelism, the second line develops further the idea of the first. So in this developmental synthetic parallelism, this is where the second line develops further the idea of the first. An example is in Psalm 121:3, where he will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. So again, the second line develops upon or goes a little further than the first line. Next, in slide 14, there is illustrative parallelism. In this type, line A conveys the idea and line B illustrates it with an example. An example is in Psalm 140, verse 7. Sovereign Lord, my strong deliverer, you shield my head in the day of battle. So the idea of God being the strong deliverer is exemplified in what he does or how he does it by shielding the psalmist's head in the day of battle. And then there's contrastive parallelism. This is where line B is contrasted with line A. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. Psalm 1 and verse 6. And then finally, there is formal parallelism. This is a miscellaneous category of parallelism where it pretty much catches all other types besides the ones we named. An example of this is in Psalm 2:6. I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. Okay. Now, the next element of Old Testament poetry is found in acrostics. That is, this element occurs when each successive line of poetry starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet, such as in Psalm 24. Or each line of a paragraph starts with the same letter, and the next paragraph starts with the next letter. Now, the only problem here is that this is not seen when the Hebrew is translated into English or any other language. You can only see it in the Hebrew. For example, in Psalm 34, verses 2 through 8, you start with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet on the first line, the second letter, the third letter, the fourth letter, all the way down that right side column. Okay, there's Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Zion, and Het. And then if you keep going down through the verses, you go all the way to the end of the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, an example of the paragraphs starting with one letter is found in Psalm 119, and this is just one section or two sections of Psalm 119, verses 2 through 16, and you can see the first letter of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is, again, Aleph. And then the next letter of the next 8 lines is Beit. Okay? And you go all the way through the the Hebrew alphabet, okay, in this particular psalm. 8 lines start with one letter. And our English translations, sometimes more modern translations, what they will do is they will put a heading above each of these paragraphs. Okay, and like you will see at the top of the first paragraph, you'll see the letter Aleph. Okay, the Hebrew letter, and then beside it you'll have it spelled out Aleph, okay, or something similar, and then it'll give those 8 verses, and then above the next 8 verses it'll have Beit or Beth with that Hebrew letter there. So in Psalm 119 we have some help in recognizing this as an acrostic, but again, it's basically lost in translation when you take it from the Hebrew into another language. Now, the next element of Old Testament poetry is figurative imagery. This element names how poets paint pictures rather than write essays. Practically every verse in the Psalms utilizes this element. But when using figurative imagery, the poet is conveying real thoughts, events, and emotions. That is, he's conveying literal truth, but they express this truth figuratively. For example, one of the types of imagery or figurative imagery is analogy. A simile uses this simile is a type of analogy. It uses like or as to draw a comparison. For example, Psalm 42:1, as the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. So as or like, okay, is used there at the first. Another form of analogy is called metaphor. This draws a comparison by direct statement. The Lord is my shepherd. Okay, it's not the Lord is like a shepherd, the Lord is as a shepherd, it's the Lord is my shepherd. But again, it's figurative language. He's not a literal shepherd. But what does a shepherd do? He guides, he protects, he binds up the wounds and helps to get them better, and so forth. Next, another type of analogy is an indirect analogy that uses the analogous item without directly stating the comparison. For example, in Psalm 91 verse 4, his faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. Okay? So, again, there's not a direct a direct statement of the comparison, but it is indirect analogy. Then another part of, or another type of analogy is hyperbole. This is a conscious exaggeration for the sake of effect. Now, the overstatement does not negate the author's honesty, okay? But again, it is done for effect, okay? To really get the person to, the reader to think about what is being said. An example of that is found in Psalm 42:3. My tears have been my food day and night. Okay? My tears have been my food day and night. So, literally, is he drinking or eating his tears? No. But is he extremely sad or despondent about the things in the context of Psalm 42? Yes. Okay. Then we have analogy known as personification. This is when human features are attributed to non-human entities. Okay? Get that. It's when human features are attributed to non-human entities. Hear me, you heavens, listen, earth. Isaiah 1 and verse 2. Do the heavens literally hear? Is the earth literally able to listen as if it is a person? Okay? So attributing personal human features to non-human entities. Next, there is anthropomorphism. This occurs when God is represented with human features or characteristics. Okay? So the first one, personification, puts human features on non-human entities. Anthropomorphism, okay, occurs when God is represented with human features or characteristics. For example, Psalm 19:4, in the heavens God has pitched a tent for the sun, as if God literally went out and pitched a tent like a human would. Okay, that's just not the case. But the imagery gives us the understanding that God is the one who created the sun, and He is the one, according to Psalm 19, who has set it on its path. Okay, and in Psalm 19 and verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. So this is just an example, a figurative example of how God's handiwork is shown and his glory declared. Next, analogy includes zoomorphism, okay, or some people may pronounce it zoomorphism. This occurs when non-human images are used to describe God. See, the word zoo comes from the Greek word zoe, which means life, and it refers to animal life, okay, non-human life. So this is when non-human images are used to describe God. So Psalm 91, 4 is, he will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. Okay? Jesus makes a similar statement in, not exactly the same, but a similar statement in the Gospels, where he stands over Jerusalem and he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I would have gathered you under my wings as a chicken, as a hen gathers its chicks under its wings." Okay, that may not be the exact quotation, but it's close. Now, we need to also keep in mind that an anthropomorphism or a zoomorphism can also be a simile, a metaphor, or indirect analogy. Okay? Next, when we talk about figurative imagery, we also need to understand substitution, or the technical term is metonymy. That is, effects and causes occur when an effect is stated figuratively as a substitute for the literal cause. Now, this can also occur in reverse, although rarely. An example is Proverbs 19:3. A foolish child is his father's ruin. Okay? This is an effect, okay, substituted for the intended cause. The things that the foolish child does that lead to the ruin of the father. Okay? Next, we have representation or synecdoche. This occurs when a representative part of an entity is substituted for the entity itself. Okay? For example, in the Old Testament, poets will often use cities or tribes to represent an entire nation. Ephraim is a term used to describe the northern kingdom. Samaria is the same, and Judah and Jerusalem are often used to speak of the southern kingdom. Okay, and then in Psalm 20 and verse 7, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Now, when we talk about military strategy and military equipment, is it only about chariots and horses? Okay? No, the chariots and horses are put for any trust in any military equipment or strategy or army. Okay? I've got a big army, therefore no one can harm me. Okay? And so these two are put for all, swords, spears, again, shields, anything that would be included in that topic. And then in slide 43, we have the category of miscellaneous types of figurative imagery. First, there is what is called an apostrophe. This occurs when a poet addresses a person as present, even though they are not actually present. For example, in Psalm 2:10, "Therefore you kings be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth." Now, the kings and the rulers of the earth are not there to hear or to read initially what is written. So he's addressing them as if they're present, but they're not. And then there's what's called irony. This occurs when a poet says the exact opposite of what he really means. The example is in Job 38:18. "Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this." Okay? And the exact opposite is Job has not comprehended the vast expanses of the earth. He does not know, and therefore he cannot tell. But again, it's irony. And then in Isaiah 41:22-23, you have, "Tell us, you idols, what is going to happen. Tell us what the former things were, so that we may consider them and know the final outcome. Or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what the future holds, so we may know that you are gods. Do something, whether good or bad, so that we may be dismayed and filled with fear." So again, irony. We know idols cannot speak. They cannot tell the future. They cannot speak of the past. They cannot do anything, good or bad. Okay? And therefore we do not need to fear them. Next, there are word plays in slide 48. This element occurs when a poet plays off variant possible meanings of a word, or else plays off similar sounds. For example, Jeremiah 3:22 says, "Return, faithless people, I will cure you of backsliding." But a literal translation says, "Turn, you sons of turning, I will cure your turning." Okay? So if it's translated as literal as possible here, then you see the wordplay. Okay, he's telling them to turn, and he's talking to people who constantly are turning. Okay, that is turning away from God, turning back to God, turning. Okay, and then I will cure you of your turning. Okay, so it's really quite interesting to see the wordplay. An example is found in Psalm 116, verses 1-4. Another example is, "I love the Lord because he hears my voice and my supplications, because he has inclined his ear to me. Therefore I shall call upon him as long as I live. The cords of death encompassed me, and the terrors of Sheol came upon me. I found distress and sorrow. Then I called upon the name of the Lord. O Lord, I beseech you, save my life." Okay, now what we're doing here with this example is we are looking for the things that are in this text that fit with the things that we have talked about, the types of structure and so forth. So I love the Lord because he hears my voice. There's anthropomorphism, okay, putting, the idea of hearing upon God, because he has inclined his ear to me. Therefore I shall call upon him as long as I live. That's somewhat of an exaggeration, kind of over the top kind of thing. The kind of, well, it's certainly good to say, I'm going to call on him as long as I live, but we know that there are times when we don't do that, okay? And then there's the cords of death encompassed me, and the terrors of Sheol came upon me. What is that? That's synonymous parallelism, okay? The very idea of death and its hold on people is very figurative, okay? And then I found distress and sorrow, maybe a developmental parallelism, that it develops further on what has just been said, okay? So, again, when we go through the interpretive process of poetry in slide 52, we need to grasp the text in their town by identifying each parallelism, locate and identify and visualize each figure of speech, and enter into the emotional world of the image, okay? Because, like, again, the Psalms, Job, okay, Lamentations especially, these are very emotional books, and to put ourselves in the place of these people who wrote, or these people who are involved in the text, is to understand and empathize, and therefore be able to apply when we go through the same types of trouble, or similar types of trouble. Then we can learn how to respond to these things. And in our example of Psalm 116, in slide 53, it says the writer is facing an immediate, scary, difficult situation. He may even be close to death itself. So he calls out to God, who listens to him and then delivers him from the situation. And because of this, he expresses his love for God. Now, measuring the width of the river to cross, we are under a different covenant. Our situation may not be as dire, but there are times when it could be. And the New Testament has a very different view of death. There are some indications in the Old Testament that tell us that they could have understood an afterlife, okay? Something beyond the grave. And there are statements, again, that I think maybe even clearly state that. But it's not much. It's very little, such as Hebrews chapter 11 tells us that Abraham looked for a city whose foundations were laid by God, okay? That is something beyond. David says when the child of him and Bathsheba dies, he says, he will not return to me, but I shall go to him. So, that gives us a little bit of understanding that they understood something of an afterlife. But the New Testament is, like in, I think it's Revelation, I forget what chapter and verse, but it says the saints who die are blessed, okay, and under that persecution, okay. I forget the exact wording too, but then another statement in the Psalms, going back to what the Old Testament understood. Again, in a very small way, there's a statement that says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Okay? his sanctified ones. But again, the Old Testament speaks of death in more of a negative way. The New Testament speaks of death in a very positive way. And again, it's all about the fact of how much is in the Old Testament. Very little is positive. Very little is looking toward something beyond. But in the New Testament, it's all about looking beyond. Okay? Now, step 3, crossing the principalizing bridge. Slide 55, God's people should express love to God when he hears them and delivers them from difficult and frightening situations, such as death. Okay? So, you can take this or form another similar theological principle. Okay? But I think basically this is correct. And then the New Testament affirms our principle. And also understand that neither the Old Testament or the New Testament speaks of or teaches that God will always intervene to save us from difficult physical situations. Again, the Old Testament was all about the physical. Again, your blessings were physical. If you obey me, you get to stay in the land. You'll have plenty of food to eat, etc., etc. And I will protect you. If you don't obey me, then I will punish you. Well, in the New Testament, our battle is not physical, okay, but it is spiritual, and therefore the physical does not matter in the end, and therefore it doesn't matter now. Now, certainly we need to take care of ourselves and try to be as healthy as we can be so that we can be good stewards of what God has blessed us with. But I'm just saying that the here and the now, the material goods, the physical stuff, God is not about a health and wealth gospel in the New Testament. Okay? He makes a statement, or Peter, I think, makes the statement that those who suffer, who are persecuted for their faith, are blessed. Okay? And Revelation 2:10, I believe, says, be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, that is either until you die, whenever that might be, or even if you have to die for your faith. Okay? So, this is what we need to understand. And then, grasping the text in our town, certainly would include our looking to God for help, even in times of trouble, that He has promised to be there to help us through it, not necessarily to deliver us from it, but to help us through it. Okay? In fact, Paul says in Romans, he says, all things, good and bad. He doesn't use those words, but all things work together for good to those that love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. So, all things, good or bad, work together for good if we will only hold on to God. Okay? You've probably heard the phrase, God is good all the time. All the time, God is good. And even in the midst of suffering, we need to keep that attitude. Even in the midst of tragedy, okay? Keep that attitude. An application of this is something that's very personal to me, in the fact that one of my mentors, one of my best friends, got leukemia in the latter part of 2015, and he fought it from 2016 to early 2017. And about halfway through all of that, I was able to visit him one particular day, and I asked him the question. I said, "What have you learned?" And he said, "I've learned that relationships matter." But he also said, "I have not one time asked why. Why me? But I have, if I'm worrying about anything, it is about what is my family going to do? Because, financially, they weren't in the greatest of shape. And he was worried about what his wife would do to deal with that, what kind of help she would have. And so, the very idea, though, that my friend did not question God, he did not lose sight of God. In fact, he held on to God through his trouble, through his time, and he eventually died February the 1st of 2017. So, again, the very idea of expressing our love to God, no matter what the situation is, and expressing our faith in God, no matter what the situation is. Now, a couple of last things that we need to understand, slide 58, is that the Psalms do not function primarily for the teaching of doctrine or moral behavior. Instead, they are inspired models of how to talk and sing to God. Okay? So look to them for a model of how to think, of how to act in certain situations, okay? How to rely upon God, how to pray to God, and how to worship God, okay? In fact, we've turned many, I don't know exactly how many, but several of the Psalms into devotional songs. And a lot of the songs, a good many of the songs in our songbook are, based out of the Psalms or out of the scriptures in other places. So, need to keep this in mind. Now, the context of the Psalms in slide 59 is that they are seasons. They are seasons of, they talk about seasons of well-being that evoke gratitude, but they also talk about seasons of anguish, hurt, alienation, suffering. And again, the idea to be thankful to God in all situations, whether things are good or whether things are bad. And then there are the seasons of surprise, when we are overwhelmed with God's gifts. And that too is dealt with very much in the Psalms. So it brings us to the end of our chapter on poetry. If you have any questions, if you need any help, please feel free to ask. And have a great day.